Hey guys, welcome to the first lesson in our course, Fallacies and Biases. Oh my. Now, I'm Connor. I'm your host. I'm the author of the Tuttle Twins books, and we're going to be going over in each of these lessons 5 different biases and 5 different fallacies. Before we begin, let's first talk about what is a fallacy. We're going to do 5 fallacies and then later 5 biases. So for now, what's a fallacy? Well, a logical fallacy, it's a mistake in reasoning or an error in logic. It's a flawed way of thinking. And what a logical fallacy does is it makes an argument sound valid when it actually isn't. And these are often used. They're widely used by people, sometimes accidentally, and they're used to persuade or win arguments. They're mental shortcuts that people take to make themselves think that they know something they actually don't, or to advance an argument that actually isn't true. Okay, so that's a logical fallacy. So let's begin with our first one, the appeal to authority. That is the subject of today's lesson. I picked this one first because it's so frequently used. We see this logical fallacy being used all the time. So I want to start with a quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He said, "No man has any natural authority over his fellow man." This quote is really establishing the fact that we are all equal as humans. As a religious person myself, I think we're all equal before God, but even if you're not religious, right, we're all humans. We all have natural rights. There's no natural hierarchy of order between people. So he says, no man has any natural authority over his fellow men. And yet we live in a society that does have a lot of hierarchy, in which there are many authority figures. And that's fine. It's not that authority is inherently bad. It's just that we need to understand that things aren't necessarily true just because an authority figure happened to say it. That's the fallacy. That's the problem with the appeal to authority. So let's break it down. Here's how the logical fallacy for appeal to authority works. In this case, you've got person A and person B. You got 2 people, right? And so person A says that person B made a claim about a subject. They said something. Person B says X, right? Here's something that's true. So then person A says, oh, well, person B is an authority on the subject. Therefore, X is true. What they said is true because they're an authority figure. So that's the basic example here. 2 people, one of whom is perceived to be an authority figure. And when that authority figure makes a claim, says something is true, the first person is like, oh, it must be true because they said it. Okay, so it's when you use the opinion of an expert or an authority figure as the sole reason for believing a particular viewpoint. In many cases, these authority figures can be true, can be accurate in what they said. It's not that because they're an authority figure, we have to disbelieve or discount what they said. The point is that simply because they're an authority figure does not make what they say to be true. Of course, we have many examples in our lives of authority figures who are perceived to be truthful, who many people believed, they acted upon their words, right? And these can be religious figures, they can be academic figures like school teachers. Certainly politicians count as an example. You got scientists and academics who claim that their research shows something to be true. The example I love to share, an easy one to pick on, is during COVID. You had Dr. Anthony Fauci, who said that he represented science, and people who criticized his policies were attacking science, right? And many people were perceiving him to be the leading authority figure on COVID, that every utterance, every pronouncement that he gave on the topic was true. You had media repeating it. You had social media, millions of people all over the world repeating it. You had people implicitly believing that what he said was true because he was the one who said it. There are many such examples in our lives of the appeal to authority. And so the caution for us, the thing that we need to be aware of, is not to believe something simply because these authority figures said it, okay? We need to focus on what's actually true. We need to verify. We need to gather data. And it may turn out that in many cases, these authority figures were true because they themselves had gone through the work to identify what is accurate. But in many cases, certainly on the political side of things, when we get into politicians and the media and the Dr. Fauci's of the world, you get a lot of incentives where these people have an incentive to lie. They have an agenda that they're trying to push. And so they want to bend the truth They want to mislead you, but make it seem like it's truthful, right? Because they have their agenda to push, and that's what matters to them, not the truth. Because sometimes the truth conflicts with their agenda. And in those cases, they would rather push the agenda rather than push the unflattering truth that impedes their agenda. So we need to beware, and we need to not assume that what they're telling us is true simply because of the source of where they're saying it. So here's an example from our Logical Fallacies book. This is the illustration that Elijah did to depict the appeal to authority. And you can see here the king, he's holding the train, which represents the search for truth. It's on a path trying to find the truth. And the king says, "Stop in the name of the king," right? And it's a silly example, and yet it shows that you have these systems, these authority hierarchies, authoritarian hierarchies, where you have authority figures who say, well, what I say goes. What I say is the truth. You shouldn't challenge me. You shouldn't question me, right? And certainly that's been the case in monarchies of old. It's the case in many of our systems today. Now, there's a fun example that we can share here in the Tuttle Twins community. A friend of the Tuttle Twins, a fellow learner, is Jaden Rodriguez. You'll remember him as the 12-year-old boy who stood up to his school, stood up to his vice principal and his teacher, who told him to remove his Gadsden flag backpack patch, right? They claimed, in that case, the vice principal claimed that the Gadsden flag had origins in slavery. Now, for those who need a quick primer, the Gadsden flag, it's that yellow "Don't Tread on Me" flag that you can see. And this is a representation of the early American colonies. This was a symbol of American patriotism. The rattlesnake represented the colonies, being willing to defend themselves like a coiled up rattlesnake and strike back if they were attacked, which is why the slogan says, "Don't tread on me." The idea being like, hey, leave us alone. Let us govern ourselves. And if you try to attack us, if you tread on us, we will bite you back. Now, Jaden had this patch on his backpack. He's a very patriotic kid, and he was told to remove it because the authority figures at his school claimed that it had origins in slavery. Here he is at an academic institution that is supposed to be teaching truth, and they were teaching a falsehood. They were claiming that this flag had something to do with slavery. That simply was not true. And yet the school director claimed that that flag, the Gadsden flag, is associated with so-called hate groups. And when Jaden's mom pushed back, when she was emailing back and forth with the school administrators, this school director cited an article. He was trying to defend himself and say, oh, well, look, all these people agree with me that the Gadsden flag is hateful. And so he linked to an article that quoted a graphic design scholar. What? I have a background in graphic design and web development before I started this whole political stuff that I do. And I have never heard of such a thing as a graphic design scholar. I don't even know what that is. And yet this individual, who is cited as an authority figure in this article, claimed that, and this is the quote from the graphic design scholar, he said, "Some may now see the Gadsden flag as a symbol of intolerance and hate, or even racism." Okay, so number one, they've established that there is this supposed graphic design scholar. And number two, he's not saying anything that's based on research, anything that's based on data. All he shared was this vague opinion that says some may now see that the Gadsden flag is a symbol of intolerance and hate or even racism. Okay, great. Maybe there's one person in the whole world that sees the Gadsden flag that way. And here this scholar is making it seem much bigger than it actually is by saying, oh, well, some may now see the flag. Who cares what some may see? Who cares if some random person on the internet has an opinion that the Gadsden flag has a connection to intolerance or hate or racism, right? This supposed authority figure who was being cited by the school director at Jaden's school was trying to use this quote and the article that it was contained in to justify his position being that the Gadsden flag had to go, Jaden had to remove it from his backpack because it had origins in slavery and was a disruption to the classroom environment. That's what they told him. Jaden, of course, as the story goes, you probably saw this in the news, it went mega viral. He refused, his mom refused. They approached me asking to help spread the word. I shared the video tens of millions of people saw the video. The school backed down, and Jaden was able to go back to school with his Gadsden flag backpack. But the point here for this lesson, talking about logical fallacies, is that that school administrator was using the appeal to authority. He was appealing to the authority of a supposed graphic design scholar to elevate that person's random opinion, saying that some in the world may see a connection between the Gadsden flag and racism. They were trying to elevate that opinion to be authoritative. And that's wrong. That's a fallacy. That's where we go wrong. Okay? So that's a modern fun example. So Jaden had been reading the Tuttle Twins books for years, and so he knew about American history. He knew about free speech, and he was ready to stand up. And that's the power of learning these ideas so that you can be able to stand up for truth as well. Well, there's another example. When President Barack Obama was pushing for his health care proposal, called Obamacare by many, he needed to whip up support. He needed to generate support in Congress. He needed to get the votes. And so one of the things that he did was he invited a whole bunch of doctors who supported the proposal to come to the White House, out on the White House lawn, for a press conference. And as you can see, he had a few of them stand next to him at the podium in their white lab coats, which they never wear when they're practicing medicine. Very few doctors actually wear these. This has become a symbol of authority, right? To imbue with credibility the individual that wears the white lab coat. And so these individuals stood next to him to visually convey, oh, these are authority figures. You should trust them. All these doctors are wise and they support Obamacare, therefore you should too. Now, this is an appeal to authority, the authority of the doctor, the symbol of that authority. And he was using it, leveraging it to encourage more support. Now, what's hilarious about this is that when the doctors showed up for this press conference, they were just dressed in normal business clothes. White House staff actually went around and distributed white lab coats to all of the doctors, as you can see, sitting in the audience, because they wanted the photo op. The administration, Obama's administration, they wanted the photo op. They wanted the powerful visual imagery on the camera, because they had a bunch of news cameras there. They wanted to show this audience of full of white lab coats of people who were there to learn and to support Obamacare and lend their credibility as doctors. Because otherwise, they're just a bunch of people sitting in the audience in lab coats. What they were really trying to do was cultivate that authority, that perception of authority, and use that to push more Americans into supporting Obamacare. Another example, Stanley Milgram. This is the famous psychological experiment, which if you don't know about, will blow your mind. Stanley Milgram was fascinated that all these Nazis during World War II were, when they were put on trial for their war crimes, they would say, oh, I was just following orders. I was just doing what I was told. And they would point to their authority figures and say, oh, blame them up the chain of command. Well, Milgram was really curious. He said, to what degree are people willing to go to do what they are told by an authority figure simply because that authority figure tells them to do it, even if they know it's wrong? And so he conducted this experiment where we had this big box with all these little switches and knobs, and each one would progressively administer a more serious electric shock to an individual in the other room. And so the test of the subject of the experiment would be seated in front of this machine, and the authority figure would be standing there in the white lab coat with a clipboard and say, okay, please do the first shock. And you would hear in the other room, ow, right? This little zap. And the person with the authority figure, oh, interesting. And he would record some notes and observations. Okay, please do the next one. And the subject of the test, the experiment, would then flip the next switch and then hear, ow, right? Progressively getting harder until the person in the other room is screaming bloody murder, saying, let me out of this thing. I'm going to sue. And the authority figure would say, no, it's very important for this experiment that we continue. They've given their consent. Even in cases such as this, please continue the experiment. Pretty soon, you don't hear anything coming from the other room as the person gives the next biggest shock and the next biggest shock. And they get really worried, right? Like, oh my gosh, is that person dead? Are they in a coma? Or, what's going on? Do we need to get medical help? And the authority figure says, nope, keep going, right? All the way to the end to administer a potentially fatal dose of electricity. Now, the whole thing is made up. The switches don't actually shock anyone. There is no one in the next room. It's all pre-recorded audio. But the subject of the experiment, the person flipping those switches, believes that it's all real. And they are doing what they are told. In many cases, despite knowing that it's wrong, they still do it. This Milgram experiment has been replicated many times over the years and around the world, and has consistently found that about 2/3 of individuals are willing to violate their own conscience. They know it's wrong to be harming another person like this. That person's not done anything to them. 2/3 of the time, they will administer a potentially fatal dose of electricity, go all the way to the end, simply because this authority figure standing there in a lab coat told them to. That shows you how susceptible we are as humans to the appeal to authority, right? It's very easy for us to do what authority figures tell us, and that's all the more reason why we need to be cautious when it comes to this particular logical fallacy, because we are very susceptible to it. We are conditioned. Our minds are prone to believe authority figures and do what they tell us. Now, we live in a society in which authority is everywhere, but that doesn't mean that you should shut off your brain. It doesn't mean that you should do what you're told simply because an authority figure tells you to. There are valid authority figures. Your parents are natural authority figures in your life, but that still doesn't mean that you should shut off your brain. If you identify that they're using a logical fallacy in conversation, you can gently point that out to them, because our quest should be truth. We should be trying to understand what is right and what is true. And that means trying to eradicate from our minds and our conversations logical fallacies such as this. We often trust authority figures like doctors or teachers for information, but that should not be a replacement for logical reasoning in debates. You need to train yourself to think critically, to think logically, and not simply trust other people because they're perceived authority figures. Again, they may be right. What they're saying may be true. You may have strong reason to believe that that particular thing they're saying is true, and that's awesome. But you shouldn't be believing that something is true simply because of the source that said it. If Dr. Fauci is telling you the vaccine is safe and effective, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is. You should gather more data. You should gather more research. All right, so let's go through a couple examples from the book where Elijah drew this for this logical fallacy. Here you got this guy saying, technology will revolutionize how society is governed. The other person says, but Churchill said democracy was the best. Right? Again, Churchill was a great guy in many respects, had a lot of interesting things that he said and did, but just because Churchill said democracy was best does not mean that that's the case. Here's another example. One person says, ingredients in that toothpaste cause tooth decay. The other person says, 3 out of 4 dentists recommend this brand. Right? Okay, who are those dentists? Who knows? Just because a majority of people support something does not mean that it's true. Truth does not need a majority to be true. Even if nobody believes it, right? Truth is still truth. So we can't listen to authority figures and believe that what they're saying is inherently true. Final example. Citizens should not obey immoral government decrees. The other person says, well, the Bible says to always obey the government, right? We need to think a little bit more logically and critically about these things to understand what is true. All right, so for the appeal to authority, certainly the opinion of wise and knowledgeable and successful people can be used to support a position. I'm not saying that we should disbelieve all authority figures and assume that they're all false. We just shouldn't replace logical arguments with logical fallacies. We shouldn't appeal to authority when we can actually try and understand for ourselves whether things are true. And so it's all the more important that we focus on facts and reasons behind a claim. Not simply believing a claim because some authority figure said it, right? But focusing on the facts, focusing on the reasons, rather than the authority figure presenting them and therefore they are actively true. If you can navigate around this, if you can understand the appeal to authority and then avoid it in your life and be able to focus on those logical arguments, focus on reason, try and understand facts and the truth, you are going to be positioned so much better than certainly people your age, but most adults who use the appeal to authority all the time. This is going to help you think critically so that when all these authority figures, especially political ones in your life, might be saying wrong things, might be pushing their agenda and masking it to seem like it's true, you're going to be able to see through it. You're going to have a little bit of a logical fallacy detector and say, oh, no, everyone's believing this just because that politician or that scientist or that media person said it. I'm not going to believe it's true just because they said it. I'm going to do my own research. Armed with this information, you're going to be in a much better position to think critically and act based on truth. So that's the appeal to authority. Let's go to the next one.